All right, we're going to begin. So if I can invite you, I'm looking at you people over here. Sit down. In a nice way, but thank you for participating in the summit today. I know some of you have been here for many sessions, and some of you may just be walking in. This is we've been alluding to in various ways. The last couple sessions today are going to kind of speak to one of the realities of the environment in which we are now. That, you know, we've talked about legacy media, we've talked about kind of the transformation and changes, and I think some of the conversation we're going to have in just a second is the presentation, and then some conversations really going to kind of speak to the reality of the environment in which we are today, which is politics. Political discourse is now showing up in spaces that are not those typical environments. So talking about the rise of things like podcasts, online shows, and streaming. So let me turn it over to two colleagues who I've gotten to know a little bit through some conversations at Media Matters, Kayla Gogarty and Julie Millican, who are going to present a little bit, some slides, then we will sit down and have some conversation, and then opportunity for Q&A. So I'm going to sneak around and I'll let you go.
Okay, I'm very short, so I feel like I have to like jump over here. Hi, everybody. I'm Julie Millican. I'm the Vice President of Media Matters. Let's see if my slides will go. Yes. So Kayla and I are going to talk today a little bit about this like divided media ecosystem that we have and who is dominating it, and just recap a little bit more about who we got there. But first, I wanted to start off by just giving you, for people who aren't familiar with our organization, Media Matters is a progressive nonprofit organization that seeks to improve the media landscape through providing research and analysis on media narrative trends, as well as countering misinformation. We're particularly experts in understanding the right-wing media ecosystem, so we will talk a lot about that, and how the right is able to craft and shape the national discourse. But our work, however, is wide-ranging, includes mainstream media and platform accountability, as well as some advocacy efforts. So I'm going to get started. So, just to start, hopefully this will be like a little recap for everybody who's just joining, and for everybody who's here, just like a refresher, because a lot of this stuff has been covered earlier, but I think it's important to set up kind of, you know, and go through some of this a little bit before we get into the online spaces. So we're in a space right now, we talked a lot about it, it's like good to see that everybody kind of has some agreement around where the problems lie and what the media ecosystem is looking like these days, where there's just declining trust in institutions broadly, and that includes the media. So for instance, in 2024, Pew Research found that, you know, only 22% of adults said that they trusted the federal government to do the right thing most of the time. This distrust spreads also to lobbyists, members of Congress, but then also like TV reporters. They're like listed on the same level as far as level of trust. And the rise of online platforms has made it really easy for both like influential media figures, but then also random users to capitalize on this distrust and spread conspiracy theories, encourage people to, quote, do their own research, and then cast doubt on like establishments and institutions, the scientific community, for instance, the media, the government, and so on. And something that I don't think I heard as much about in the sessions that I attended today, but the COVID pandemic really contributed a lot to this trend, with people resenting institutions and experts who were asking them to make major changes in their everyday lives. On top of this, there was just a lot of fear and uncertainty, and the information that people were getting were changing on a regular basis because a lot was unknown about this pandemic. And so people were, you know, becoming more and more distrustful that information they heard this week is contrary to information they heard the week before, and it became hard for them to know who to believe, and, you know, it became easy for them to feel like they were being lied to. At the same time, there have been massive shifts in media consumption in the last few years. So online shows right now are actually now more popular, and in some cases more trusted. They're being seen as trusted news sources. The data has shown that streaming has overtaken traditional TV, and YouTube is actually, in particular, the platform that is like the largest. It is the most people are tuning into YouTube on a daily basis over cable and traditional broadcast. Also, the majority of people this is from a Pew study, a majority of Americans report that they're getting most of their news online now. News websites are still listed as the top online news source, but not really by that much. Social media is rapidly becoming the preferred online news source, and it's likely to surpass traditional news sites in the near future. Pew also found that over the past 4 years, I thought the stat was pretty incredible, that TikTok has seen a 5-fold increase in consumers who use it for news. That's just in the last 4 years. And in this consumption pattern, there is a huge generational divide. So younger audiences, I'm talking Gen Z and millennials, the majority of those audiences are getting their news, A, from social media, but despite the fact that B, they're not actively seeking out news. And so we're gonna get a little bit more into how that comes to pass in a minute. Lots of conversations about this today, so none of this is groundbreaking, but it's still really important. Local news is shrinking. Since 2005, more than 3,300 newspapers have ceased printing. In the last year alone, 130 newspapers have shut down. Circulation is down. Visits to the top 50 papers' websites have also declined since peaking in 2020. A few of them, like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journals, still are doing pretty well, but overall the trend is on the decline. Media consolidation is also serving to de-emphasize local news and focus on national politics. There's some Stanford research that was showing that the 3 largest owners control about 40% of local news stations and are present in 80% of media markets. And there are over 200 counties in this country that have no news outlets at all, and over 1,500 that have just one. And if people were here for some of the earlier local news conversations, some of those, when you're talking about there's 1,500 that just have one, they're like skeletons of what they previously were. They're not really able to deliver the level of reporting that they previously were. So there's just many communities where there's news deserts that aren't being served well. And civic engagement is down because of this, in one sense. And I want to point out something else that we've seen, is that when the decline of local media, it's not just that people were going out to their local paper to seek political news. Some people were, surely, but a lot of people weren't. But they were looking to see sports. They were looking to see entertainment. They were looking for info about their schools, and they would kind of come across political news as a side effect of that, as a consequence of they're opening up a paper. They kind of see some things that were happening, but they were really trying to get to finding out what happened in the high school football game that weekend. But that was still relevant in participation. That still did actually translate to people coming out in higher numbers when they were voting. And we're kind of seeing a similar type of trend now where people are not seeking out political news, but they are coming across it in their social media feeds and in these non-political podcasts that are talking about more cultural issues and whatnot. And Kayla's going to get into a lot of that in just a minute. The other big thing there, the revenue model is shot, the advertising model is shot. Kayla and I both listened to this podcast the other day with Chuck Todd, was talking. And it was actually really interesting because he made a point that I hadn't heard before about how Craigslist really had a huge impact on local media revenue model, because most local media, especially newspapers, used to get a lot of their revenue, or a big chunk of it, from the classified section. So when Craigslist came along and then offered this up for free, it really just bottomed out a ton of newspapers. And then from there, they were relying on advertising revenues and circulation numbers. And as we see, when social media came on the scene, all of the advertising money flowed into social media away from newspapers and local television. They also, social media really tried to recruit news outlets to come onto their sites. I'm old enough to remember the whole pivot to video trend that happened probably about 10 years ago. And where everybody was trying to all the journalists were trying to create this viral content so that they could get people to click on the links to their articles. Clicking on the link to their articles led to more ad revenue, and that would fund their papers. But the social media platforms themselves largely decided pretty soon that they didn't want to be in the news business anymore. They started downranking news content, and that, at the same time sucked up all the advertiser dollars for themselves. And the other thing that I get why this has to happen, but I think it's an impact that doesn't get discussed a lot, is paywalls. Paywalls make it really impossible to access these articles if you're not a subscriber. So if you see something on social media and you want to find out more about it and you click on the link, 9 times out of 10 you can't read the article. And so it's not actually helpful in spreading information, and it's not really helpful in optimizing engagement on your site. And the fact is that traditional news really just can't compete in a social media environment that prioritizes engagement over the quality of information. Outrage, conspiracies, fear, really emotionally evocative content keep people engaged and on the platform, and that's how those platforms are designed. Straight reporting, usually doesn't, let's be honest. It's very important, but it's not as exciting as a conspiracy theory. So then we get back to this has been a theme I've heard over the course of the day. The Americans just don't trust the press. So trust in media has completely cratered, and it's particularly among partisan lines, and particularly amongst Republicans. So for context, in the 1970s, 2/3 of Americans said that they trusted the media a great deal or a fair amount. Now that number is 31%. That's across all parties. 69% of people say that they don't trust the media much or at all. And then Republicans in particular are incredibly unlikely to trust the media. This number has really skyrocketed since Trump first ran for office. And now we're at a point where 88% of Republicans say that they have low trust in media, with the majority, 59%, saying they have no trust in it at all. Why might that be, you wonder? Well, I think it can be explained a bit, at least, by the right's decade-long kind of attack in the credibility of mainstream reporting. I guarantee there's not a person in this room or probably in this world who hasn't heard the liberal media attack before. This dates back decades to the Nixon era, at least, and it served a couple different purposes. One was, they were trying to drive reporting to the right to get more favorable coverage by constantly accusing the news media of being biased and having liberal bias against them. The media, journalists are taught to be fair, present both sides. They don't want to be accused of having a bias. They really work very hard to keep that out, and I think that instinct was exploited to an extent. But they also were doing this at the same time that they were building out an alternative right-wing media ecosystem to advance narratives. So a ton of money was poured into this. But back in, if you look back into the 80s after the Fairness Doctrine was repealed, talk radio on the right exploded. Rush Limbaugh was the king of conservative talk radio, but they really dominated that medium. Limbaugh drew an estimated 15 million people per week. Even now, 17 of the nation's top 20 most listened to talk radio hosts are conservative. And then the same thing, they applied the same playbook to cable news once cable news started to come on the scene. A lot of people aren't nerds like me and maybe don't know that Fox wasn't the first attempt as a conservative cable network, but Fox was certainly the most successful. And once they launched in the 90s, very, very, very soon they were dominating the ratings afterwards, and now there's several different right-wing cable news outlets. And then when social media began to become really important mechanism to shape news and advance narratives, the right didn't start to apply the same strategy. They invested a lot in building out alternative social media platforms, Rumble, Gab, Truth Social. They invested a lot in right-wing content creators. They really put a lot of time and money, frankly, into being able to build out the infrastructure there. At the same time, they really went to war with social media platforms in order to try to change content moderation policies that they felt didn't benefit them. And there was a lot of this claims around there was an anti-conservative bias on the platforms, despite the fact that our research and others had shown that right-leaning content, again, consistently outperformed left-leaning content. The result, though, was that there was right-wing narrative dominance across platforms. So now we're in this environment where the right has a very sophisticated information infrastructure through which to advance their narratives. So messaging used to be a little bit more top-down. It used to be driven by like Fox News or the Rush Limbaughs of the world, and then it fanned out around the rest of the supporting infrastructure. But now it can move so quickly, it's almost like a narrative by reply guy. Like any claim that fits the right-wing agenda can be plucked from obscurity and go viral in an instant. So I'm going to turn it over to Kayla, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about our work that we've done looking at the online media ecosystem.
Thanks, Julie. All right. So we're going to dig in a little bit more now on the online media ecosystem and specifically look at the rise of videos and podcasts and streams and other long-form audio and video. So some of you might have heard the 2024 election be referred to as the podcast election. This is in part because presidential candidates, Trump and Harris, as well as their vice presidential picks, made various appearances on online shows and podcasts ahead of the election. And this tactic was particularly effective for Trump, who reached an audience of 24 million Americans on podcasts in an average week, compared to just Harris's 6 million per week, according to Edison Research. And Trump and his allies knew this tactic was effective. At Trump's election party, victory party after he won in 2024, his ally Dana White praised several of the podcasters for their role in helping him get elected, and you also saw several podcasters and influencers at Trump's second inauguration. And so why was this tactic effective? This is in part because online shows are now more popular and they're also more trusted news sources. So some interesting statistics from Edison Research and Pew Research, they found that since 2016, the number of people listening to podcasts monthly has doubled. And this is now reaching more than cable networks, for instance. We've also seen that 1 in 5 Americans said that they regularly get news from social media influencers. And they trust these sources too. 87% of people who hear news on podcasts said they expect it to mostly be accurate, and 31% said they trust these podcasts more than other news. So after the election, there was a lot of discussion about these online shows and how they might have affected the election, particularly how they might have promoted or benefited Trump. So we wanted to assess this online show landscape and provide data for these anecdotal conversations that were happening. So we conducted a quantitative study and compiled popular online shows, so podcasts, streams, and other long-form audio and video content that was regularly posted online. We identified whether these shows self-described as being a news and politics show or whether they said that they were, focused on sports or entertainment or other non-political categories. And then we evaluated if they did in fact talk about news and politics and whether they did so with a right-leaning or left-leaning ideological bent. And what we found was 320 online shows that often discuss news and politics with a right-leaning or left-leaning ideological bent, and then we went ahead and assessed their audience size. So to assess the audience size, we gathered publicly available data on the number of followers, subscribers, and views across streaming platforms, so YouTube, Rumble, Twitch, Kick, and Spotify, as well as social media platforms that are used to amplify and promote the shows, so Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And we had several key findings, but first and foremost, we found substantial asymmetry with right-leaning shows having 5 times as many followers and subscribers across platforms as left-leaning shows. As you can see from this chart here, the right-leaning shows are indicated by red and the left-leaning shows are indicated by blue. And if you take a look, you can pretty quickly see that there are way more red bubbles and there are much larger red bubbles. So this means that there are more right-leaning popular shows online and that these shows have larger audiences. In fact, we found that 9 of the 10 top shows with the largest followings were right-leaning. Only Trevor Noah's show, which was categorized as left-leaning, even breached the top 10. And I'll talk a little bit more about these top shows soon. But in addition, We also found that this dominance is across platforms. So, YouTube is a place where these online shows have the most followers and subscribers, but when we looked at these other streaming platforms and social media platforms, we found that the asymmetry was pretty similar, where the right was dominating compared to the left-leaning shows. We also found that the right-leaning shows had more views. So we specifically looked at the views that these shows were getting on YouTube and Rumble via their channels. And we found that right-leaning shows accounted for 2/3 of the total YouTube views on videos from the channels that we looked at. Okay, so now looking back at some of the top 10 shows, this includes Rogan, Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, Russell Brand, Theo Von, Charlie Kirk, the Nelk Boys, Candace Owens, and Dr. Phil. Those are the 9 of the 10 which were right-leaning, and then as I mentioned before, Trevor Noah is included there, which was the only left-leaning show. But if you take a look at that list, one thing that might stand out to you is that all but one of them are hosted by men. So that included the top show, which was Joe Rogan's show. He has about 40 million total followers and subscribers across platforms. And according to Edison Research, in October, his audience was overwhelmingly male. A majority of the listeners were within the 18 to 34 age range. And politically, the plurality was independent, or they identified as something else. So that kind of shows that people aren't necessarily tuning into Rogan to hear about news and politics. And this was across the board with the top 10. So 6 of the top 10 were self-categorizing as supposedly non-political shows. So they said that they were comedy shows or focused on education or society and culture. Ben Shapiro, Russell Brand, Charlie Kirk, and Candace Owens were the only ones that said that they were going to be talking about news and politics throughout their show. And this trend extends beyond just the top 10. We actually found, out of our 320 shows, we found 111 self-identified as non-political, saying that they focus on comedy, business, sports, or other non-political categories, and about 3/4 of those were right-leaning shows. And these right-leaning shows spanned across a variety of categories. While we found both right-leaning and left-leaning shows that self-identified as being focused on society and culture, comedy, entertainment, technology, and education, the right-leaning shows also self-identified as religion, sports, gaming, wellness, and others. So what this means is that as people are going to hear their favorite comedians or watch interviews with their favorite celebrities, they're being exposed through right-wing content, messaging, and guests almost unintentionally. Like, they're not going to these shows to seek out news and politics, but they're being exposed to this content among the comedy and the entertainment that they're hearing. And it's an effective tactic. We aren't the only ones that have found that right-leaning content is seeping into these supposedly non-political spaces. Bloomberg reviewed 2 years' worth of episodes from 9 popular online shows that included Rogan and Theo Von. And I thought this quote was interesting from them. They found that none styled themselves as political pundits, and their conservative talking points were sandwiched between freewheeling discussion of sports, masculinity, internet culture, gambling, and pranks, making the rhetoric more palatable to an apolitical audience. So we have also dug a little deeper into these shows and specifically looked at how they have covered Trump, his second administration, and his policies. And what we found is that amid some of the comedy and entertainment and interviews with celebrities, we found that the hosts and the guests are claiming that Trump was a brilliant marketer, saying that he's always 10 steps ahead of whoever he's negotiating with, and pushing other pro-Trump messaging. We also have heard some of these podcasters and hosts kind of parrot some of what the administration has said. So after the administration gutted USAID, we heard Rogan kind of repeating some of the talking points that the administration had said, and saying that, falsely saying that the organization was corrupt or engaging in criminal behavior. We also dug into how the shows covered Trump's tariffs plans. So in the week after he announced that he was going to be implementing these widespread tariffs, we found that most of the right-leaning shows had a largely positive spin on the news. There were some notable exceptions. Ben Shapiro and Joe Rogan were pretty outspoken in their criticism of the tariffs, but among some of the others, there were some full-throated praise of the tariffs. At the same time, there were some that, might have had some limited criticism. So maybe they said that, there's going to be some pain, or, at least in the short term. But in the end, they were like, trust Trump, give him the benefit of the doubt. He's executing the art of the deal. This is just going to be short term. Like, trust him to, for this to go well, basically. So even when there was some limited criticism, we were seeing overall that these shows were covering him in a positive way. In addition to this sort of right-wing content seeping into some of these non-political shows, we're also seeing right-wing personalities trying to expand their audiences and using lifestyle content to do so. So one example of this is Candace Owens. She's a right-wing personality and former Daily Wire host. She's usually known for her political commentary and not really known for celebrity litigation, but she's recently delved into the Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni lawsuits, becoming Baldoni's toughest defender and loudest defender online. Some social media users said that all they've heard about the lawsuits has been from her, or that content from her has led her to other content, and this has been pretty effective. In just 2 months, she added almost 2 million followers to her social media accounts as she was covering this celebrity content. And so as, somebody might come across her video about Blake Lively, they might then click into her page or start getting additional videos on their For You page, and before you know it, they're being exposed to her right-wing or conspiracy theory content. Some other right-wing hosts have similarly kind of started to breach into this lifestyle content. We've seen Brett Cooper and Megyn Kelly, who are also right-wing personalities, starting to get into this as well. So as online media has grown, we have seen impacts specifically on younger people. So, social media platforms like TikTok, they provide less quality control on news, and their algorithms have really created a feedback loop that furthers misinformation and hardens information silos. So as you saw, I think in one of the earlier sessions, they were showing how there are videos that spread online and how difficult it is to see whether it's AI generated or whether it's being misrepresented, and the algorithms of these platforms help spread and proliferate that sort of content. At the same time, it's also pushing people into silos. So as you start engaging with certain content, maybe right-leaning content, you start getting pushed into a For You page that has other similar videos or even more extreme videos. So we've done several TikTok-related studies. And so when we engaged with transphobic content, the For You page started increasingly giving us hateful and violent content on our feed. In another study, we interacted with 5 popular hosts of the supposedly non-political shows, so like the Nelk Boys and Theo Von, for instance. And what we found was just within a span of a few hours, we were seeing conspiracy theory content on our For You page and other toxic masculinity content. And this kind of information siloing is having an effect. And one way that we're seeing this have an effect is through the growing partisan divide that we're seeing between young men and women, who are increasingly getting their news from social media. Last week, NBC released a poll, and they found that Gen Z men gave Trump a 45% approval rating, compared to just 24% of Gen Z women. And while other generations and age groups had gender gaps in terms of this approval for Trump, it was most notable in terms of Gen Z. For instance, millennial men gave Trump a 49% approval, and then millennial women gave him 40%. So we're really starting to see that divide happening among young men and women, where they're getting their news from social media. And that's all we have, so thank you. We're going to have, I think, a discussion next.
So we have some space for, like I said, a little bit of moderated conversation, and then we'll do Q&A pretty soon. So we'll go that way in just a second. So one of the themes that has come up from what you were presenting some of your research, and we've heard it in prior sessions today, about this issue of decline in trust. And your research talking about sort of the movement toward these kind of new ways of accessing information, podcasts particularly really kind of stand out. You use this phrase, this podcast election. What makes you say that in contrast to any of these other sort of factors, forces that come, because we have so many questions about these big, where do people get information? How do they know? This is, particularly the podcasts are all wrapped up in these other pieces, right? Some of these folks are framing what they talk about as lifestyle or comedy or the whatever else. And so this I guess the first piece is, why use that sort of frame of reference as this podcast election, and will that just kind of continue to be the trend that we see when it comes to political figures leveraging these platforms, or are we in an anomaly, or is it just like the new thing? So I'll either both, however we want to go.
I'll start. In terms of the podcast selection phrase specifically, news outlets and others have been using that phrase. I think that at least the podcast had some effect. Was it the only and sole reasoning? Probably not, no. But it did have an effect in terms of reaching these audiences that are not going out to seek news and politics. And yet that sort of information was still seeping in and they were still consuming it, even though they weren't intending to.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think to your question of is this a trend moving forward? Absolutely yes. You're seeing more and more. You're especially seeing on the left this recognition that they're way behind the ball on engaging in these podcasts and these online media figures. There's a lot more effort on their end in trying to figure out who they should be going on to, who they should be talking to, how they should do that. We hear these conversations a lot. But I think if you just look at those media consumption trends that we talked about earlier, there's no end in sight as far as eyeballs moving online, streaming overtaking traditional news. That as long as people are tuning into those outlets, people are going to need to be speaking to them. That doesn't mean there isn't still a role for traditional media. There absolutely is. And it doesn't mean that political figures shouldn't be talking to traditional journalists. Journalists are going to actually interview people. They're going to hold their feet to the fire. They're going to ask hard questions, and you're going to get probably a more informed conversation out of it. Podcast hosts are, they tend to not be as critical, and they give a more friendly interview. They're free flowing. They're more conversational. So I think that there's still a role for sure, and I think that the news media still really needs to be the ones that are holding the power structure accountable and shining a light on what's happening in there. But there's no denying that this influencer space is still growing, and that's where the trends are going.
And we talked particularly about young people, particularly young men, right, becoming a kind of a primary audience here. But it makes me also think of my father-in-law, who is not a young man. He is in his early 80s, and has said pretty passionately recently that he doesn't trust lots of traditional forms of information sources, and he himself has turned to kind of online streaming, particularly YouTube, as a place to get information. And so, for all the reasons that we think about particularly young men, so one question is why young men? But two, I think we're also seeing these sort of interesting kind of dynamics that there is. I mean, one of the points made, podcasts have more reach than cable, for example, right? So the sort of changing landscape, paywalls come into play, other sort of factors that, we can access podcasts and things without cost, right? We just have to listen to the ad at the beginning or maybe the middle and all these sorts of things. But how do we think about this as, I don't want to say this, why young men? But also, it also seems like a lot of other people too, right? The context that we're discussing right now is this sort of political realm, but like this is sort of a trend, right? I don't know, maybe this is a show of hands of sorts from the folks in the audience, but how many of you listen to podcasts or anything sort of online to feel like you become a more informed person? All right, so maybe not. Maybe I'm off here. Anyway.
I'm going to jump in first on the. I don't have like the perfect answer on the why young men, but I will give an observation that we've seen over the years is that the people who were making content that young men were interested in tended to be right-leaning, right? There was like people, they're talking about sports, you're talking about gaming, you're talking about gambling, you're talking about like dating. That's a big one too. There's a lot of dating based podcasts. So if you're a young man who's interested in sports or wants to get some dating advice or whatever, and you start, listening to these podcasts, you're going to then start to get introduced, like these hosts tend to be more right-wing, and then when they do talk about politics, it tends to come from a right-wing slant. So we've been saying for a long time that there's nobody on the left that's speaking to young men. There just isn't. There's nobody on the left that's really engaging young men the same way. So it's really not surprising to me that we're seeing this kind of bear out now in that shift in the gender gap that you're seeing with Gen Z. And that is something that they've just, the right is really good at identifying where audiences are and meeting them where they're at. And they're really like the ones at this moment that have their finger on the pulse of the culture. That's just how it is. And so they've been engaging in those spaces. And the other thing that I would point out is that right-wing content has always been better performing. It doesn't really matter what the medium is because it's emotionally driven. And it's especially optimized for like social media algorithms because it provokes a very strong emotional response in a lot of cases. The ones that are explicitly political tend to drive a lot of like us versus them, poking in some anger, like triggering, emotional responses, strong emotional responses. And that's the type of thing that social media algorithms really, really like. And that's the type of things that keep people engaged, that keep people wanting more. I mean, you just got to keep feeding that audience, and that's also where you kind of get into the situation where there's a lot of confirmation bias that's happening, where they're giving them information that is like validating beliefs that they already have, and that's that's a powerful incentive structure.
Yeah, and I think that some of these shows already had these trusted audiences. Like Rogan, for instance, for years, people have known him back to his UFC days or whatnot.
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe give some context because he's such an outsized figure. Yes. And I mean, even just recently, there was some sort of kind of publicly calling him out, right, for kind of naming the dynamics of the show. But can you give a little bit of the backstory to why that plays a role here?
Yeah, so Joe Rogan, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or so, was part of the UFC fighting and eventually evolved and has a very prominent podcast, the Joe Rogan Experience, where he sits for like 3 or so hours and talks with whomever, his guest is at the time. So he's had this following for quite a while. And so these people trust him already. And so, you're, like I said, you're not going for news and politics. You're going there to listen to whomever he's interviewing or whatever topic he's talking about that, you already, listen to him. You feel like a camaraderie with him. You listen to him on a weekly or, multi times a week. And so there's that sort of camaraderie. And so now you trust him. And so as he starts bringing some of these right-wing guests on, or as he starts talking and kind of delving into these right-leaning, topics, you're more likely to, agree or at least, kind of feel that it's accurate.
Can I add one more thing to add to that? I think it is a really important point that Kayla is making about the relationship these podcasters have with their audience. It is very personal. You're listening to it in your car, you're listening to it at home, you're listening to it at work. People really feel like, especially because of how wide-ranging the conversations can be, that they know these people, right? So in addition to that, what the right does very well is that they also promote each other and bring each other both on their shows to kind of widen their audience, so it becomes like more of a club. where it's like this other guy, you know, who has he also likes sports, we're going to talk about XYZ, and then, you know, you start listening to their show too, and they promote each other's work, and they develop like a network, and they expand that kind of family feeling, you know, to other shows. And I think that also helps like kind of build audiences and sustain audiences, and that's not a trend that we notice as much on the left.
So, in so many ways, you kept talking about the sort of the right-leaning kind of, you know, podcasters, and I'll just kind of use podcasters as shorthand for these other pieces too. But like, you know, this is pretty predominant. The left is underwhelming at best, right? In your kind of research as you've done this, but like, there's nothing inherently about these sort of platforms that like require it to be the more right-leaning views, right? I mean, this is just a good utilization of technology, right? Knowing how to leverage this the same ways that someone like a Limbaugh, right, figured out how to turn kind of AM radio, for example, in a lot of parts of the country where I used to live, for example, into a pretty significant audience. But is it? Why such a disparity of this sort of, you talked about this sort of asymmetry, right? But like, is it because it is, I mean, the left is not also absent of having the sort of divisive sort of language, the sort of us and them and these sorts of things. Framed, I mean, and maybe push back on this, but like, this is just one of the sort of vexing questions that I have about this kind of new landscape that we're in, because we're not kind of going away from this, we're gonna only further go this direction. There are all these sort of questions about the sort of journalistic standards that don't have to exist on a 3-hour podcast, for example. It's not, as we've been hearing from so many practicing journalists, the work, Gianluca earlier today was talking about like this, you know, the robust work that it takes to sort of kind of debunk false claims and things. Like, how do we navigate this sort of landscape? Since this is going to continue to be it, and we're going to continue to see the retreat of local news, seemingly, right? Cable news is also kind of diminished in some ways just because of sheer audience and the financial components. Like, are we just to kind of read the landscape and say, well, this is just it, or what?
I have a few points that I will make to that, and I'll try to be brief. But as far as like kind of how we got here, and yes, you're right, like, no, you don't have to be right-leaning to be on social media. That's obviously not the case. But I think there's been a few different things. Number one, the way that the right produces content, as I've mentioned, is definitely more optimized for social media. That kind of emotionally driven, evocative content, like it performs better. And, you know, left-leaning political content tends to like appeal more to like, you know, facts and reason, and it doesn't provoke the same type of emotional response that's going to drive a lot of engagement and keep people clicking, keep people listening, et cetera. So there's just a one aspect of it where like, you know, the left-leaning content just isn't optimized the same way. That could change. You're seeing some content creators that are starting to engage that way, and I think that there's a lot of traps that they can fall into about like pushing their own mis and disinformation in order to like chase clicks. But the other thing that doesn't get talked about as much in some of these spaces is like the financial infrastructure and the financial incentives that also lead to this. So first of all, there's just a ton of, didn't come out of nowhere. There has been a lot of investment into right-wing content and right-wing creators and right-wing media for decades that has not been matched on the left by any stretch.
Why? I mean, maybe that's not a fair question.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you want my personal opinion, I think the left is, I think the right is very good at playing the long game and the left is not, for a short version. They want immediate results on something where the right's willing to like put a bunch of money into something for a long term in order to see results. So it's been an effective strategy and it's worked. I mean, that's my simple answer to it. Obviously, there's a lot more complications to it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but
you don't have a crystal ball over there, I don't think, right? So you just don't know.
I mean, and then I think the other point, the third point I was going to make is that there are people who identify as like progressives, as liberals out there that have big shows that are in the culture space. They just do not engage in politics on those shows. So they will self-identify somewhere else, but when they're on their podcasts that have these large followings, they're not talking about this stuff at all. And so there is this like reluctance, I think, with some of these content creators to engage in politics, and some of it could go back to that funding infrastructure that I was talking about. We've talked to influencers, for instance, who they don't have deals where they can just kind of create content and not have to be reliant on sponsorships and ads. And when they started to engage in political content, they lost advertisers and they lost sponsors because the sponsors didn't want them to be affiliated with that type of content. And so because of this lack of investment in the content creators themselves, I think that contributes to it.
And I would just add that I think the right is really good at evolving and meeting people, kind of where they are. We saw them, take over talk radio. We saw them take over, social media and really learn how to use it. And now we're seeing it in this space as well.
Okay. And a phrase that I think I believe it's Amanda Ripley. She has the phrase conflict entrepreneurs. And there's an economic incentive in some of this, right? And so as we think about the sort of media landscape and its challenges, how do we find ourselves out of that is a really significant question. But I want to ask if there are other people who have questions, not just me. So we've got a couple, they are running to get mics, so they are literally mic runners. But we'll have a space for some questions. I see one hand right up here, and then, hands a flurry. All right, so we'll start here and we'll work our way back that direction.
Thank you both so much. I wanted to jump back to the point you made about the idea of the right-wing podcasters and how a lot of them are on each other's shows. There's sort of a club that comes about with that. The question that I was trying to formulate in my head this whole time was sort of in that same vein. The word that I kind of had was the cross-pollination. When we're looking at Joe Rogan, obviously is sort of the exception to this rule, someone who's had a lot of those other guys on there before. But even Theo Von, when I saw that map that you guys did, Theo Von had Tucker Carlson on. Theo Von's been on Joe Rogan's Experience. A lot of the comedians start out that way, even if they evolve, even if they don't necessarily go political. But then when you had the left-leaning podcasters on there, I saw there was a disconnect between who they are. Trevor Noah has a national profile, obviously, for being on The Daily Show. But then not a lot of people are necessarily looking to the Young Turks. Some of those other ones, they feel kind of disjointed. It's not so much a question, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts about sort of what that looks like on the left in terms of that cross-pollination. Because to me, there seems to be something there between that 5-to-1 disconnect between Trump's reach and Harris's reach in terms of reaching national audiences through podcasts. But I was just wondering kind of your thoughts on the way what's happening on the right, but maybe contrasting that with the lack thereof on the left.
We have seen some podcast networks on the left, like Crooked Media, for instance, like you said, the Young Turks. There are some. I think one of the things that I noticed was the importance of YouTube when we were really digging into the data, and that this is a small finding, but for instance, we saw that the right-leaning shows or the right-wing networks of podcasts, they would have an individual channel for every single show, and those would be promoted on different platforms. They would clip the shows, and then you'd have it on TikTok and stuff like that. We did not see that sort of amplification from the left-leaning shows as well. So I think that sort of amplification and boosting your content across platforms really does help bring in other eyeballs to that content.
Great. I know there's here, and then we'll work our way back that way.
Okay, hello. First of all, thank you both so much. I genuinely have learned so much, and it was very interesting. And so something I wanted to ask was about information silos. In our class, Citizen Civility and Change, we talk about silos, what that means. And you both mentioned about how silos led to a partisan divide between men and women. And so I am just wondering kind of how to maybe break that. That might be the bad word to use or incorrect word, but should we rely less on podcasts, more on local news to escape those silos? Or can silos be beneficial, and how can we do that? I don't know if that makes sense, but.
That's a really difficult question, to be honest. I think it's very hard to break the information silos when where people are getting information from are designed to create them. And so I think the challenges that you have is so long as that that structure is incentivized by social media platforms, you're going to continue to run into that problem. I think it unfortunately comes down to, like, on an individual level, you have to start kind of challenging your own assumptions, and you have to recognize things like, if I'm having a very strong emotional response to something, especially if something's making me really angry, that's a sign that I should take a step back and maybe verify what I'm listening to, and, you know, check the sources. Don't, you know, there's a lot of, like, media literacy components of it that go in, but I do think that we're kind of in a difficult and a tricky spot when, you know, there's not just, like, the platforms are set up not just to keep eyeballs on, but they're also incentivizing creators to create that type of content. So TikTok, for instance, has this, like, a creator incentive program now that we've done some research around that shows, you know, is really incentivizing, like, conspiracy theories to go viral on the site, because, you know, the AI conspiracy theory specifically, and it's, you know, unfortunately, like, there is a lot of various factors that are kind of making money off of this, and as long as that remains the case, I think it's going to be hard to break. So not to say it's, like, hopeless, but I just don't have a solution for you, unfortunately.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, so thank you all for being here so much. Really appreciate it. My question was kind of twofold. One was just about 10 years or so ago, we started seeing the cord-cutting revolution, people getting rid of cable packages, opting more for a la carte services. We see the rise of streaming, which obviously, no doubt, then creates more of that custom curation of content we're exposing ourselves to, which probably lends itself more to that partisan split for media consumption. But my question is kind of what a lot of, like, your local affiliates, NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox, a lot of that was, oh, well, your local news is your last place for unbiased media coverage. And that was your anecdote to your CNNs and your Fox News and your MSNBC. Kind of cable was your slant, and this was your more unbiased. So does that pendulum ever come back around? Do we see that local news as that anecdote, or is there no longer a craving for any of that bipartisan or unpartisan news?
Yeah, the polls had consistently shown that local news was, like, the most trusted news source. It always had been ranked that way. I've heard some people making some points, and I actually think they're really interesting, around the media consolidation of local news and what impact that has had around the trust in institutions. So what I mean by that is people trusted local news. They didn't necessarily trust national news. But when their local news reported on a national story, then it validated the story that the national media was, like, reporting on, and then it gave people a little bit more trust in that information. And when you're losing that, that's contributing, again, to some of this, like, distrust in institutions and distrust in news. So I think there were some interesting, you know, new models. I know that they talked about some of them here, to try to kind of find ways to address these, like, news deserts, as they're called, on the local side. The first things that we saw, though, kind of coming in, and you kind of see this everywhere, is, like, when there's an information void, like, there's partisan actors coming in to try to fill the void, basically. So a lot of the early stuff that we were seeing coming in were more like what there was. I mean, it was both left wing and right wing, to be honest. You know, but they had a political bent to them. So I'm hoping that, like, with the investments into more, like, nonprofit media reporting, like ProPublica has started to do more journalism, like, in various states. I think, like, these types of models need to be replicated, and there is a lot more, like, foundations that are starting to invest in that stuff. So, but the thing is, you need to be really hyper local, and I'm not sure. I think it'll take a long time to dig out of that. But, you know, hopefully with some investment, there is activity happening in the future. So maybe we can get to a better place there.
Okay, thank you. And the question there.
I have really more of a comment than a question, which is that my colleague in my department, communication, Danigal Young, wrote a book 5 or so years ago called Irony and Outrage. And she basically looked at how people on the right and people on the left have different aesthetic preferences, and that the sort of anger and outrage very much appeals to people on the right, and satire and irony appeals much more to people on the left. And so I'm not convinced that even if there were more people trying to replicate what the folks on the right are doing, that they would have the same success with it. But I don't know what that means in terms of how do we get more comedy? How do we get, that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, maybe that's, Trevor Noah was the biggest blue circle, is that right?
Yeah.
So,
And a lot of, if you look at the crooked media people, a lot of their shtick is that they're, very cynical. And even though they're very political, they're very, cynical and jokey. But I think there's you bring up an interesting point. I would love to, if I was in the academic space, I would actually spend a lot of my time looking at the different audiences and what appeals to them, because I think it's really fascinating. But there are things that I think liberals could do in their content that is not necessarily we are going to drive outrage. I don't actually love that as a strategy, but some of the things that could be done is understand that people want that sense of community. They want something to identify with, and you need to offer that to them. And it's not really being offered to them at this point. People want to connect. They're emotional people. They connect emotionally, and we again go back to treating everybody as though they're just always operating on logic and reason, and that's just not realistic. So I think there's some things that you do to try to address some of the asymmetry. But I'm maybe a little bit of a cynic. I do think that asymmetry is always going to exist. It always has. I just think there's things that could be done to make it better. But again, you go back to talk radio, you go to cable news. It always has existed like this.
So we're just about at time, so I want to ask one very last kind of relatively short question. And based off of this work that you're talking about today, what were you most surprised by that you learned in doing this research?
I would say I was most surprised by the fact that when we dug into some of the shows, we found that some people were, personally identified as progressive or liberal, and that content was not seeping into their shows at all.
I was surprised at how much time men spend listening to podcasts, to be honest.
What else should they be doing, maybe?
Yeah,
Right.
it's wow, if you look at this, this is a lot of men just for listening to podcasts.
I'd like to think maybe they're driving someplace, but maybe not, right? So
I'm not judging, I was just surprised.
that's another great research question, but not the one that you've done today. Well, please join me in giving a hand to Kayla and Julie. Thank you for sharing your work. And in many ways, we're going to take another 15-minute break, then we're going to close out the summit with our very last session. And in fact, we will have two podcasters sitting up here on the stage talking about and sort of sharing some of their experiences and the reality of what that looks like and how that plays out in their experience. So please stick around for Dave Rubin and Tara Palmieri, and we'll see you back at 6:30. Thanks so much.